llamo Garrett McQueen.
Y me llamo Scott Blankenship.
Esto es TRILLOQUY, historias, verdades y reales de los flecos de la música clásica.
Bienvenidos a TRILLOQUY.
Hey, mixing up my romance languages. Sí. I thought we would start things off in Spanish today, just to well, first of all, not to get too political, but did you see the debates where the candidates were trying to speak some Spanish? What did you think of that?
I love the look on Cory Booker's face when
Yes.
Beto went off. He was, you're going to do this?
And Beto went off indeed. You know,
Yeah.
I can't have a political conversation. You know, my official second language is Japanese, but I couldn't have a political conversation in that language. Are you able to do that in any other language?
I took Spanish all the way through high school, so I can kind of get a feel for what they're talking about, but I don't know any of the specifics.
Well, I guess that's about it for us then.
Yeah.
But the guest on today's Opus knows Spanish very well, my good friend Alex. And before we get into his conversation, Scott, I wanted to talk about the difficulty of meeting people when you move to another place, and then when you finally do meet people or meet a person, how you kind of latch on. So you talk about how when you moved to the Twin Cities, that was your first big move.
Oh, yeah.
I made many, many big moves in my life. So after graduating from undergrad in Memphis, the first place I moved to, the first place I lived was Los Angeles. I
Jeez.
drove cross country something like 33 or 34 hours in the car. I actually enjoyed the car ride. You get to see how diverse of a landscape America has. You know, you go from the sort of the swampiness of Memphis and the Mid-South to, you know, when you're going through Arkansas, getting into Oklahoma, it starts to look much more drier, greener, lots of pine trees and
The
stuff.
plains.
Yeah, and then you get over into the panhandle of Texas where all of a sudden it's like desert and
Yeah.
you see nothing but tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds are a real thing. I was excited to see them in real life, you know, getting into what's next, New Mexico, Arizona, and then you cross over the border to California and you think you've made it, but you got a long way to go still. I mean, it's still like 4 hours or something on the drive. Anyway, so moved to Los Angeles to go to USC. And it was rough for me at first because I didn't know anyone in Los Angeles. So, you know, I felt really alone there. And I did eventually make friends. And one of them was Alex, who's featured on this opus of TRILLOQUY. And, you know, I say all that just to ask you about sort of your way of meeting people and getting rooted here in the Twin Cities when you moved here, 13 years ago?
It took a really long time, and I was a little bit disappointed at how closed the society was here.
Yeah,
I mean, you hear
yeah.
rumors, but you always think, well, that's, people are making jokes or something like that. It really can't be that bad.
They used to say the best way to meet someone in Minnesota is to have gone to kindergarten with them.
Yeah, yeah, or high school, or you're
Yeah.
in college, or your cousins, or something like that. And what I tried to do was continue on a tradition that I had in Omaha, which was hosting dinner parties.
Sure.
We had a rotating dinner party in my building every other week,
Mhm.
and there was always new people coming, and I loved it. And I always thought that food was the great equalizer, because I love to share food to this day, because I mean, when you've got a bunch of different people around the table, and you have some good food and some good drink, by the time you're at the end of it, it's really hard to be mad about something.
It is, especially with the drink. Well, it can go the other way if if it doesn't go too great. But
By the way, Saturday night, Sunday was a long slog for
oh
me.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we kind of hit the town a little bit. Hold on.
Let me finish that thought, though. So moving here and trying to get that sort of existence, that sort of lifestyle going again just wasn't happening. And I used to beat up on other people and beat up on myself about it. But then again, I thought, well, why are you holding up the people that you're meeting now against the people that you knew for years in your old hometown?
Yeah.
But having said that, the main reason why I didn't move away until I was 36 years old was just fear. I was really afraid of being lost, of being in a different city and not knowing anybody or knowing where to go. So I'm really sympathetic with your experience of going to someplace like Memphis over to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But then if you couple that with you're moving to a different country and maybe you don't have a firm grasp on the language and those people don't want you there.
Yeah. That adds a whole nother level to it. But yeah, through the difficulties, I made great friendships that I really appreciate to this day.
There it is. There it is.
Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say before we get into this interview, I cannot underscore the closeness of our relationship. So, everywhere I've moved, after Los Angeles, it was Detroit. While living in Detroit, it was New York a lot, then to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I didn't know anyone, here to the Twin Cities. Everywhere I've moved, I've managed to really cultivate a really tight relationship with someone. Lots of folks in Memphis, Alex in Los Angeles, Jonathan in New York, Shelly in Knoxville, you, Scott, here in the Twin Cities. So I want to dedicate this episode, this opus of Trilloquy, to friendship. So this is the story of my dear friend Alex. Alex Rosales Garcia, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks, man.
I was sure to get your whole name and make sure I had it right because I've seen you on social media talk before about how important it is for people to understand that is your whole name. What's behind that? Teach us about the three name that you carry.
Yeah. So basically, I do have three names. Well, I mean, to be more specific, I have four names if you include my middle name, but that's pretty common with I'm gonna say Mexican naming practices, but it comes from Spain. So you get your mother's last name and your father's last name. So my first name is Alexis. My middle name is Said. My father's last name is Rosales, and my mother's last name is Garcia. So to shorten it down, it's just Alex Rosales Garcia.
And you speak from not just having Mexican heritage, but being from Mexico, right?
Yeah. So I was born in Morelia, Mexico, and then immigrated to the U.S. later on. But yeah.
I know the story of how you came here, but I think the listeners would really appreciate hearing that story as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a different story for people that aren't used to hearing it. For others, it's a very common story. But basically, I moved to Tijuana, which is border town in
Right.
California, and lived there for probably like a year or so. And keep in mind, I was in kindergarten, so I had very little knowledge, and all these moves were happening without me knowing anything. So all I knew is I was going to get kindergarten in Tijuana. Um, as a lot of people in Tijuana and San Diego and basically all of Southern California do, they go to visit the San Diego Zoo.
That's just a
Um,
normal thing.
I mean, yeah, I mean, everybody knows in the U.S. the San Diego Zoo is the spot as far as zoos are concerned.
Right.
Um, so we all got on a bus and we crossed the border into the San Diego Zoo. What was different about my story compared to all the other classmates, was that me and a couple of other students were pulled to the side and we were told, we're actually going to give you a different passport, and your name, my name at that time was going to be Jose. Even though I just explained to you what my actual name was.
Right.
But young me was more very naive and kind of cute and was like, no, but my name is Alex. And they're like, no, 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 it'll be Jose. I was like, okay, sure. And where are we going? We're going to the zoo. Okay, fine, fine by me. So we get to the border. The agents don't actually talk to me ever. I mean, at that time, this was mid 90s, so 1995, I believe it was.
Sure.
Um, they just kind of like counted the number of passports and counted the number of kids, and all right, you're good to go. As soon as that bus crossed the U.S. border, they pulled me and the two other students out. And I believe that bus continued on its way to the San Diego Zoo, and nothing was different about that. But me and the other three total students were taken to this home, and we just kind of chilled in that home for a while. I do remember the home in particular because they had Super Nintendo, and that was the it thing at the time. So I realize now that I was waiting for my grandmother to cross the border legally through her visa because she's never had any interest in living in the U.S.
Wait, so sorry, did you
Um,
know whose home this was you were staying at with the Super Nintendo?
no clue, no
So,
clue to this day. Just
to this
it just
day,
seemed
you
like
don't
a
even know.
yeah. To this day, I just kind of pictured it as a almost like a babysitter,
Oh
if that
my
makes any
goodness.
sense.
Yeah.
It was just like there was so many kids there. And like there was kids in like the kitchen, in like all the different rooms, in the backyard, like running around playing soccer. And I was like in the living room with a bunch of other kids, and there was only one controller, I remember that, in the Super Nintendo, and a bunch of students just kind of sitting around, or kids. Um, anyway, so I waited there for what seemed like a while, and I did start realizing at one point, like, okay, what's actually going on? Like, are we going to the zoo still? Like, what's happening here? And then a gentleman came and told me like, "Hey, come with me." And okay, sure, I'll go with him. I mean, I have no other choice really at this point. And they took me to some mall. I realize now it's in San Isidro, which is right across on the American side. And that's when I met up with my grandmother and my aunt. And then they said, you know, we're gonna get on a bus, I believe it was, and we're gonna drive get on a bus and ride all the way up to San Francisco, where you'll meet up with your mom.
Oh
So
my
that's
goodness.
basically, yeah. So that's the story of how I crossed here illegally. And I lived undocumented in the United States from 1995 till 2005. In 2005, I became a resident, and then in 2015, I became finally a full American citizen.
I want to sort of understand some more of the details of this.
Yeah.
So, when you left home in Tijuana that
hmm
morning to go to the zoo, who are you leaving behind at home? Was your mom there?
No, my so just a little bit of context. In 1984, there was a pretty dramatic like economic crash in Mexico, and it hit my state in particular, Michoacan, pretty hard because I mean, we're all kind of farmers, and it was kind of called the tortilla famine at times. Anyway, my mother had already come to the United States before that, so she was
Okay.
already living in the United States, and her story is quite dramatic. Like she actually scaled the wall
So,
and like ran. Yeah.
so, what was your relationship with that as a kid? Did you know that your mom had crossed the border, that she had left indefinitely?
I did not know my mom actually.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I didn't know my mom, so I just knew that there was this really nice lady from far away sending me all these little toys. And I
Oh my
realized now
goodness.
that I thought it was really cute, but my mom was doing the best that she could, and they were all just like McDonald's like play meal toys. Which I mean, for me, it was fine. Like this is great, this is awesome. I'm just getting free toys in the mail.
You are making my
Um,
eyes swell up right now because because you as a kid, you can't know that on the other side of the border is this woman who's your mom just thinking about you the whole time and wanting the best for you and hoping that everything goes right and she gets to see you again.
right. I mean, she really went through the entire stressful process, and I mean, keep in mind there was obviously no cell phones at that time, so I do
Right.
remember my grandma stopping at like payphones and just like calling every so often, like, you know, we're here now, we're there now. And I remember my grandma, and I talked to her to this day, she was like, I was so nervous, like waiting for you at that mall where, you know, that was the meetup place where we're gonna re-meet up again. And I was just so nervous waiting for you. And like, were you actually gonna be there? Like, were these people, the coyotes, you know, like
Yeah.
were they actually honest? Because I don't know how much money they paid, but I know that my mom paid, you know, a couple grand to bring me over.
Oh my gosh. And then of course, I'm sure that, talking with your mom and your grandma today, it's just, you know, I'm sure you guys have to revisit those stories so often.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and there's a lot of empathy, I guess, going along with that as well, with a lot of other people that are going through the same, um, or have gone through the same. Because like I mentioned in the beginning, it's kind of a common story within some certain aspects of our American community. Well, in other aspects, it's kind of like, you know, that's very different.
So anyway, you were picked up at the mall. You rode a
hmm
bus up to San Francisco, and then
hmm
began your life. Something I wanted to make sure I asked you: how comfortable are you telling that story with the state of things today. I mean, children in detention centers.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're giving something away? Are cross trips from Mexico to San Diego to the zoo still a thing for students? I mean, what's your perspective
Right.
on how your story relates to today?
Things are certainly dramatically different, I would say now. The border is so, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, my mom actually climbed the wall and ran to the nearest Motel 6, and she knew some English, and she was the lightest, of my entire family. She's, the lightest skinned, so she could pass off as American. Um, and that, I mean, just that in itself just does not happen anymore. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is you get a lot of programs where you you end up pushing people to places in the border that are not heavily guarded, but that's usually like in the middle of the desert. And so the cross now is significantly more dangerous than it was in, I mean, early 90s, late 80s. With respect to the children's camp now, I mean, that's just awful. That's just genuinely awful. And I do, now that you're mentioning it, like, man, that could have been me. I was in technically an unaccompanied minor crossing the border. Um, and I would have fallen if, if my story was in, 2018 or 2019 and not 1995, then I would be in, you know, Clint, that Clinton facility in Texas. That would be me, and that's horrifying. So the state of affairs now are definitely much more dangerous, Garrett, to be honest with you, than they were when I crossed.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into the story of how you got into music and eventually made it out into a career. But I just think that story is so incredible. And you talk about you described it as the tortilla famine. It's not just people from south of the border wanting to come here because they just want to come here, but because in a way there's a feeling that you have to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. My Yeah, man, that's absolutely right. It just felt like, what are our options if you're farmers in Mexico? You can move to the capital of our state, and we already live in one of the poorer states. So I mean, that's not it's moving more laterally than moving up. Or at that time, you could try to move to Mexico City, and from my mom's own account, anytime she went to Mexico City, she's like, you can't wear any jewelry, you can't wear any fancy clothes, or you'll get attacked on the street. Which even now, that's completely different from Mexico City today in 2019. But back then it was much more dangerous. So your option was, well, let's go north. Let's go north because we've run out of options in our own home, and we need to put food on the table. And that to me makes a lot of sense.
Do you ever feel any obligation to one day return to Michoacan or Mexico in general to do your part in doing something? I don't even know.
Yes and no, and that almost touches a little bit on like identity, like
Of
what do I
course.
identify as?
Right.
It's yes, I would say yes. I feel some attachment to going back and helping, just because my grandparents still live there. I mentioned earlier, my
In
grandma has,
Michoacan.
yeah, they have zero interest in ever living in the U.S. Um, so they are still there. My entire heritage is there, if that makes any sense. Like I don't feel like a minority there,
Yeah.
to put it lightly. Like
Yeah.
it feels like it's my ground. But at the same time, like, I mean, geez, man, I've been living in the United States since 1995. Like, I fully consider myself, American. I'm a diehard Giants fan. Um, so it's a little bit of both. And I've accepted and gotten to the point in my life where if I cross the border into Tijuana, it feels like home. And at the same time, if I cross the border back into San Diego, it also feels like home.
But do you feel comfortable doing that with everything going on these days? Even
I
even with your papers and your legal status.
Yes, I do feel comfortable with that, because I do have citizenship now. And there was a little bit of time where the citizenship was like this card that, like, you can't touch me. ICE can't no longer touch me. I'm a full citizen. I do everything completely by the law. I've never been arrested, never gotten in trouble. So I do feel like I have like this safeguard around me. which makes me confident crossing the border. Like, I know my rights, I know what I can go. I know that when I cross into Mexico, I have my Mexican passport, and I have my American passport as well. So even with all the things happening at the border now, and I did mention it did get more dangerous, if you have citizenship, it all of that, it's almost like you're protected from it.
And then you talk about, identity and feeling safe and feeling
Right.
home. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case for you or even people like me within the walls of classical music, if you know what
Right.
I mean. So you and I met at USC, and we instantly had like a really tight bond. And in retrospect, for me, I feel like it was a bond in sort of being, or at least feeling like the outsider in that space. Of course, going to USC was, some pipe dream for me. I just wanted to live in Los Angeles, Southern California. Didn't really know anything about the prestige of that school, but
Right.
but with your being from California and doing your undergraduate work at UC Irvine, was it?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
You had a perspective on that school and that institution. Did you feel like identity or race would be a conversation for you as a student at the University of Southern California?
Um, no, actually. And
That's
this is
good to
this is
hear. Yeah.
where, yeah, no, because I was naive, to be very, very honest with you. I knew that once I was graduating from UC Irvine, I knew I wanted to go into Bassoon, and I just looked up schools in California because I didn't want to leave California. So I was like, well, I think this USC school is pretty good for bassoon, and so is San Francisco Conservatory. I'll just apply there. So I just applied to both of those schools, USC and San Francisco Conservatory. I had a significantly better audition at USC than at San Francisco. Um, got more money because of that to go to USC than San Francisco, and I ended up at USC. And like you mentioned, that's where we met. But it wasn't till I got to USC that I was like, whoa, it's white. It is, yeah, there are no other Mexican, much less undocumented musicians at the school.
Well, before we get specifically into your time, our time at USC, for people who've never gone through a school audition process, sort of paint that picture for me. What was it like auditioning at USC versus, you said, the San Francisco Conservatory, and the factors that you think led to a better audition at USC?
Right. Well, like you mentioned, I was graduating from UC Irvine, which UC Irvine from USC is without traffic under an hour, maybe an hour at most. So I mean, you just kind of drive there, which is what I did. I drove there, parked, warmed up, and I had friends that had already graduated from Irvine and had gone on to USC School of Music.
Mm.
So I was texting them, asking them, like, where do I park? Like, what should I expect? What does the building look like? So I was much more clear about that. And I think that just made me feel more comfortable and in my zone when I was auditioning. As opposed to San Francisco, even though I mean, you and I believe your listeners know San Francisco is very expensive.
Of course, yeah.
So my family has been moving away from San Francisco, as the years progress. So they actually live out in like the North Bay, which is Vallejo. So it's about 45 minutes to an hour from San Francisco Conservatory Music. But I had to fly home first and then borrow my mom's car to come back down. And there's parking is impossible at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And ultimately, I didn't feel so much in my zone, even though technically it was my hometown, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the best audition. I still did well, and I did still get into the school, but I think that was reflected in my financial aid package,
I see.
which
Yeah.
eventually, yeah.
It's something how we just don't really think about the outside factors that come inside for us. Because I sent a CD and got admitted to USC, so I was in my
That's
living
right.
room feeling completely comfortable, and I just never would have thought how the stresses of getting in and out in the city, because LA traffic is nuts anyway.
Right.
So wow, yeah, that's incredible. So yeah,
That's right.
you ended up at USC. what were those first few, I won't even say days, but first few weeks or maybe that first month like for you? Did you feel like this was going to lead you to the profession? Did you feel like you made the right move in those, in your first few weeks at USC?
Absolutely not.
Oh wow, talk to me
It
about
was
that.
it was awful, and I'm hoping you don't have this memory. But in the first master class at USC, um, I was finally exposed to. I mean, I don't know. Do you remember how big the bassoon studio was at that time?
I think there were like 9 or 10 of us.
Right, 9 or 10 plus the two teachers, right?
Yeah.
And I had to play during the master class, and I was just completely out of my zone. I was like, what? I have to play for all these people so they could just sit there and judge me? Like, really? Like, I never did that at Irvine because, I mean, Irvine's great, but it doesn't have a bassoon studio that has 9 people. Um, so I was freaking out. I had a nervous breakdown during, I was playing Chike 5, I remember that now. The third or fourth movement or something like that,
Uh-huh.
some bassoon excerpt.
Yeah.
And I started like shaking, like shivering, because I was just so nervous. I was just so not used to it. And the first few weeks can be characterized as me taking a dramatic step back in my progress as a musician because I was so not used to playing in front of other people. I wasn't used to always being put on the spot.
And you had a new teacher on top of all of this.
Yeah, I had a new teacher. It was, a new city, even though, like I mentioned, it was only like an hour away. I was still trying to get used to, like you mentioned it earlier, the traffic is a thing when you're living it daily. Um, yeah, in short, it was very, very difficult for me the first few weeks just to get adjusted. It was a lot of nervous breakdowns, trying to figure things out, and eventually it got better, but I did take one dramatic step backwards before I could move forward again.
So where did you find solace? What helped you move forward from that giant step back?
Um, well, I don't honestly, there was two people at my very, very, very first year, which is I think the only year that you and I actually crossed over.
Right.
Um, it was you and Sean, my teacher.
Hmm.
Really. And it was you, and if you remember also Jordan, she was another mutual
Yeah.
friend of ours.
Shout out to Jordan. She's
Um,
so sweet.
Shout
Yeah.
out to Jordan. Yeah. We would always hang out and we would have these moments where we would literally go to the taco truck and just decompress, and that really helped a lot.
I
Um,
talk about those taco truck trips all the time, actually.
yeah, no, I mean we would literally do that all the time, and I would invite you to Giants games and you would come along with your magazines, but you would come along nonetheless.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just, and that's what you know. My difficulties started after I got into the profession because I didn't have that sense of community, and I feel like when we're in school, especially grad school, on the cusp of really branching out, we might take for granted how important it is to have those friends and have that support system to just help you get through. Because taking lessons and all of that can just be so stressful on top of writing papers and doing everything else you have to do at a school like USC.
Absolutely. And to that extent, also shout out to Sean because he was at that moment very personable with me and very understanding and flexible. And boy, did I lie sometimes just to get out of lessons because I was, unprepared and just like was not ready for the workload of graduate school and figuring it out. But man, was he really flexible and did not give up. And I had you and Jordan to help me there, and it worked out. I would
I'll
say that,
I'll give Sean Mauser a shout out, I guess. But
yeah.
since you've brought his name up and since now we're here, I feel like it's a great time to revisit the story that that what I'm thinking about.
The story.
So, most of the time, and you remember this, Alex. I
Hmm.
was placed principal in the orchestra.
Yeah.
I was that bad bee, as they say, and
Until you left, and then I became that batter bee.
but for one piece in particular, Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony, it has such a
Ooh.
huge bassoon part that Sean Mauser and my teacher, Judy Farmer, decided to audition for it, just
Mhm.
to give everyone an equal shot and all that sort of thing. I won that
It was a blind
audition. It was a
audition.
blind
Yeah,
audition. I won it anyway. But
you did.
I was very interested in like the feedback, and when you're in school, hearing what your teacher has to say and getting the critiques and all that stuff is very important. Well, when I reached out to Sean, your teacher, Sean Mauser,
Hmm.
through email for his feedback, he never responded. And then I caught him like in the halls or something one day, and in my memory, it was very rude. And he
Hmm.
says, "Oh, well, I don't have anything for you," and that caused a schism between the two of us, me and you.
Yeah.
What's your take? Now years later, what is your take on that situation?
Well, I think it's funny now because like ultimately it's like it's Shostakovich 9. Like who cares, you know? Like,
At the end of the
but
day, but back
at
then,
the end of the day, but back then I just remember thinking like I think Garrett's wrong on this one. And that's what caused the I think the little rift. And it wasn't a very long rift because we still ended up hanging out.
of course,
Um
you felt like I
but yeah,
wasn't
'cause
entitled to anything from him.
not necessarily. I just felt like if you look at the actual music, I still remember it's a particular D flat that you wanted to like grow to and then be like really quiet and subtle to be extra musical.
Yeah,
And I
dramatic
like I
even.
did yeah, exactly. Um, but I was also very literal. And I'm gonna say at that time I was more literal than I am now with what's written in the music. And I was like, well, no, Shostakovich is this way. You clearly did not do it that way, Garrett. So it was wrong. It's very like a binary way of looking at things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
And I think I'm not speaking for Sean, but I think that's probably where it was coming from. It's like, well, it's not what's written in the music. And if Shostakovich would have wanted that more dramaticism, then he would have written that. Whereas you were coming from a like, I'm just trying to make something out of it and try to be different because God, it's always played the same way. So in the years that have passed, I can see both sides now. I can definitely see I could stand up for you, and I could also still stand up for Sean. He doesn't need somebody to stand up for myself more. But yeah,
so if you had to
no.
if you had to play Shasti 9 today,
Hmm.
would you have a more literal interpretation or one that was more dramatic, one more one that's more interpretive?
I would have a more literally dramatic interpretation, if that makes any sense. I would try to express myself as much as I can within the constraints that Shostakovich wanted.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, wow, it's great to go back to
Yeah.
that time. I'm glad we finally did make up because it was a little while where we weren't speaking.
Oh yeah, and we all felt it too on both of the studios.
Oh, you're saying so Sean's studio. So it was kind of Sean's studio versus Judy's studio.
I mean, you said that yourself. You said that yourself at times, and it was very competitive at USC at that time, I'm realizing. But it was good. It was a healthy competition. Like we all hung out, but we all took auditions pretty seriously, and we all tried doing our best to represent our studios.
Right. And and I remember being in the weird situation of and I feel comfortable saying this. Most people saw me as, at the top of the bassoonists at
Hmm.
USC, and I felt uncomfortable creating what I felt like was unnecessary competition there, but that's what the music industry is. Certainly classical music, when you go take that audition, only
Yeah.
one of you is going to win it, and that's that. So I guess for me, I think that competitive nature that was sort of created in that situation and other situations ultimately helped us both out in the end because we both eventually won jobs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, after you had left, we that competitive nature continued. Me and another student, Brittany, at that time continued that like competitiveness, and then
Yeah, shout out to
other
Brittany.
students.
Yeah.
Yeah, shout out to Brittany as well. And or at least I felt it. She's probably like, what? Or at least I felt the competitive nature. But it was healthy and it was good and it was necessary. And you said it best. It both helped us out.
So, in the midst of finishing up at USC, you were also cultivating a nice little career for yourself in Los Angeles, not as a member of a full time orchestra or anything in Los Angeles, but just teaching. And it seems like specifically you were teaching youth that looked like you or could speak to an experience similar to yours as someone who's Mexican American.
Yeah. So yes, I am a teaching artist for the LA Philharmonic's Yola. which is Youth Orchestra Los Angeles. It's an El Sistema inspired program. And yeah, I began teaching there. I don't know, probably like halfway through my graduate school at USC, and at that time there was, one one bassoon student, literally. And
At the in the YOLA
in the
program.
YOLA program, yes, in the YOLA program. Since then, the studio has like, dramatically grown and, shrank and grown again. But it's averaged more or less within the last couple of years between like 6 and 9 students. And you're right, most of them are Latino, specifically Mexican American students, and undocumented as well.
Wow.
So I taught from a very like personal point of view, if that makes any sense. Like
Oh, of
I like
course.
like I've lived through this, guys. Like I've done a lot of these things as well. And here's what worked for me. I'm not saying it's gonna work for you, but to give you an idea for you to take ownership of your own education, here's what I did and here's what helped me out. And I got really attached to that, if that makes any sense.
I mean,
I kind of, yeah.
yeah. Oh, well, I was just going to say, do you feel like you're more effective? You have more of an impact with those students because you have that lived experience. Because you're a phenomenal musician. You can teach students of any color, but again, there has to be something very specific about teaching Mexican students for you.
Right. I mean, and like I mentioned, like a lot of my students are Mexican, not necessarily all of them. So you definitely have a point there. But I'm able to, in short, Garrett, I'm able to balance like very structured and disciplined musical training with the personal, and like being very personal. And like sometimes I teach lessons completely in Spanish. And that's, sometimes a challenge for both of us. It's just like, well, how do you say your D flat is sharp in Spanish? Like, so
Because you learned music through English.
yeah, the American A B C D E
Yeah.
F, method. Yeah. So it's fun and it's very rewarding. And I think I've been successful at it because as I mentioned earlier, I'm able to balance the personal with the very structured as well.
And then, of course, your affiliation with Yola has taken you back to Mexico
Yeah.
since then, right? Talk to me about one of those trips.
Right. So I worked for the Gustavo Dudamel Foundation in one of their encuentros, which it means the encounters. But in this particular encounter, which is God, I think it was March of 2018 now, so a while ago, last year. The point was we would have Canadian students, American students, a lot of American students, YOLA, we had the Atlanta Music Project, Miami Music, just a lot of students from the United States, a significant amount of students from Mexico, students from Argentina, Puerto Rico, a lot from Venezuela, of course, because El Sistema is Venezuelan. And they all came together in Mexico City, and they're basically trying to figure out what things we have in common. And I was particularly good at that job because I spoke English and Spanish pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my Venezuelan counterparts struggled more on the English side. A lot of my American counterparts struggled more on the Spanish side. But I fit this like very particular niche where I was like, hey, I'm really good at this particular thing. Like I can switch between Spanish and coach, your way through Shostakovich pretty easily. So I found myself really excelling at that, or I found my niche, like to put it better. Uh,
For me, when I think about going home and going into some of the communities that I grew up with, I have to ask myself, does this thing called classical music even matter to them, or should it even matter to them? I mean, is that something that you ever think of, especially being back in your birth country?
yeah, no. I mean, I'm just gonna say it outright now. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter. And I'm almost using classical music to teach them these really valuable life skills that sometimes Mexican American students or Latino students in general, Black students in general, don't have access to. So how can we teach them Dvorak or whatever it is that they're learning, but teach them actually how to be leaders, how to speak up for themselves, how to take, I said ownership earlier, how to take ownership for their education through, playing bassoon, playing Dvorak's New World Symphony on bassoon, and how can we create this community between, Argentinian students all the way down there and New Brunswick students in Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're trying to use classical music, and I've thought about this, and I've thought about your question. Not that you've asked me before, I've just thought about it on my own. No, I mean I could be trying to teach him these life skills using karate, using soccer, but
Classical music just
it's
happens to
classical
be
music.
the path that, you're meeting
Yeah,
them on.
exactly. Yeah.
But to be fair, I guess when you say ownership, I think that Mexico very rightfully has ownership of classical music. When you think about all of these Mexican composers, the
Hmm.
tradition of Mexican music, I mean, I'll call it Mexican classical music, traditional mariachi playing,
Hmm.
other traditional sounds. That has to, showcasing that to young Mexican students has to be a way to sort of help them understand more about themselves and their culture. It would seem to me, anyway.
Absolutely, and I think we're giving them a tool to explore that. Um, for example, 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we finished up Yola Camp. So it's every summer for 2 weeks. We take these, kids from LA, go up into the mountains in Ottawa. It's like 7,000 feet up in the
Oh
mountains,
yeah, shout out to
and
Idlewild. I've been there.
yeah, and it's like a very intensive. It's like a very intensive music making process, and within this, it's very traditional style of teaching music, like there's a quarter note, eighth notes, intonation is, you have to listen and match and you have to blend the sound and everything. We're teaching them these skills, but we also give them this opportunity to explore other aspects of music that they feel comfortable with. And in one of our skits for the talent show, we have this like little talent show at the end of the week. The students played banda music on their own. So
Oh
they took
wow.
all these skills that they learned and they played traditional Mexican banda music and they danced traditional Oaxacan jarabes. And I'm thinking like, that would have never happened if we hadn't just taught them these skills as a first place, like, how to read music, how to play clarinet, how to play the tuba, how to play the trombone, how to, work as an ensemble, how to conduct yourself. They took those skills and they created their own banda. At our program in East Los Angeles at Torres, there's a student-run cumbia group. So I feel like they're connecting more with the roots now that they have these skills, and they're kind of branching out and growing on their own. And that's beautiful. I mean, that's what it's about, in my opinion.
Oh yeah. So talk to
Yeah.
me about that as it relates to your career as a performer, as a bassoonist with the Las Vegas Philharmonic Orchestra.
Yeah.
Do you feel like I'm not asking you to throw your organization under the well, you have tenure at this point, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so we can trash them if we want to. Do you do you feel like they are playing enough music by Mexican composers? I mean, I just feel like automatically the answer is no.
No. I mean, and there's not many orchestras, particularly like in the Southwest, that are neighbors to, Mexico or like New Mexico. I was reading recently, the state of New Mexico is majority like Hispanic.
Right.
And you don't see them playing the orchestras there, playing majority Hispanic music. Um, so no, it's Las Vegas Philharmonic does not play enough music by Mexican composers, but LA Phil doesn't either.
I mean, but
And
do you feel compelled to go into some of those offices or go into some of those meetings and say, look, we need to diversify our programming?
yes, and we did do that to a certain extent. So I will give them a positive shout out for our youth concerts in Las Vegas. We played to, I believe it's almost every single fourth grader in Clark County, Nevada. Um, and last year's youth concert series, we were exploring musics of the world, and we definitely hit on dance song number two. I mean, we could have hit on
Oh, of
so many
course,
other,
yeah.
I know, but we hit on like the one Mexican piece that everybody knows on dance song number two. And last year or two seasons ago, we also did Redes, which is by Revueltas,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that actually caused a kerfuffle, Garrett, to say the least, between the audience because people started speaking out afterwards. There was a post-concert conversation, which almost never happens, but a lot of people stayed, and there was people screaming at in the Las Vegas Philharmonic audience saying, "This is just propaganda for Mexico, blah blah blah,"
Oh my
and our
God.
conductor had to say like, "I have to remind you guys, this was written like in the early 1900s."
Wait,
Like this
wait.
is from a different era.
Let me make sure I'm hearing this
Hmm.
correctly. So at the concert, there were vocal reactions from the audience saying that this is propaganda. This is you're just trying to get
Yep.
us to. Oh my god! So that of course that had to make you feel some type of way sitting up there on stage.
Well, by then I was already in my, I remember now, I was in dressing room number seven getting changed, changing back into my regular clothes. And we have this TV where we can see what the, the house is doing and what the stage is, what's happening. And it was a professor from UNAM, which is Mexico City's, the National Autonomous University, and our conductor up there answering questions. And there was this audience saying, I think this is propaganda. And then another audience member saying, like, no, this is ridiculous. It was not propaganda. This was just a film with Mexican music set to it. And so it got a visceral reaction, definitely from the audience. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I was back there changing, like, talking to my friend Carmen, the second clarinetist, and my friend Tyler, the second trombonist, saying like,
Oh
"Are you
wait,
guys?"
Carmen Izzo.
Yeah,
Oh
Carmen
yeah,
Izzo. Yeah,
a fellow USCer. So shout
yeah,
out to
fight on.
Carmen.
Um, yeah. So I remember looking at him. I was like, "Are you listening to this crap? Like that's nuts out there." And
I just feel like I would have to go out on stage
yeah,
and
right.
address. I mean, did you? I don't know. That just has to. I don't want to like put words in your mouth or anything,
Hmm.
but if it were me, I would just feel so obligated to go out there and address that, followed up by thinking about my place in the organization and larger than that my place in classical music. I mean, do you when you think about situations like that, just flat out racism in the classical music hall, do you never doubt whether or not you even belong in that space?
Yeah, yes, at times I've definitely doubted, and I think I've messaged you about it because there have been times where I'm just like, I just feel like some the brown man up there, doing his song and dance for all these rich people out
And I
there.
imagine
I
you're the only person of color in the organization, or what
uh
among the musicians maybe.
Among the few, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
One of the few Latinos. Um or maybe the only Latino. But yeah, but I think what made me not go out there was that those same audience members were being called out by other audience members saying like no, no, like that's not right. That's wrong. So it was like a healthy conversation within the hall. And I just thought like, this kind of needs to go organically just because like there are both sides that are being vocal. And I think these conversations need to happen. It was a little shocking that it happened in the Smith Center in Las Vegas, right?
Yeah.
But it it,
Well,
it
maybe
happened
not to
nonetheless.
me,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, sure.
so yeah, wow. I don't think I had heard that story from you. So were there any kerfuffles since then? Have there been any similar situations?
No, no, there have not been, but we have also not played uh music by composers from very no. I'm gonna say no because we just had this Dvorak festival, and obviously nobody went up there and said this is just propaganda for Dvorak or so. No, that has definitely not happened since.
That's interesting. So what that makes me think is, and not just specifically the Las Vegas Philharmonic, but other
Hmm.
organizations, programming to stay away from some of those touchy subjects, especially again, considering, going back to where we started our conversation, what's going on at the border today
Right.
and opinions on that. I don't know. You know me. I don't mind shaking the table a little bit and
Hmm.
and and ruffling feathers, but do you think orchestras should, try to engage some of these political conversations or keep music completely separate? Because for those
Yeah.
two things aren't separate. You are a musician and you are someone who is Mexican.
Yeah. Here's my answer to that. If you are in an orchestra that is a border state to Mexico, or maybe was prior to, our current situation, a part of Mexico, then yeah, yeah, you definitely owe it to your audiences and to yourself to program more Mexican music and make the political aspect be seen. Especially if you're in, California, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Colorado, like all these Spanish states, states with Spanish names, like they have a significant Hispanic, significant, in particular, Mexican population. So I do think you owe it to yourself to perform more works, not only by Mexican composers, but by Latin American composers, and to address that political aspect. Now, if you are in, further north, like, Minnesota or
Sure.
Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, it's a little bit less relevant, and I feel like you're almost forcing that conversation. But it wouldn't hurt to have a concert every decade or so.
Or not, or
you
not,
know?
or not that the conversation is less relevant, but it's just not as immediate. It's not as in sight as it is for an orchestra on the southern border or near the southern
E-
border.
Exactly, because I mentioned Minnesota, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. Those are all border states, of course.
Right?
Just
Yeah, different border.
a different border. Yeah.
So in closing, if there's someone listening who has never heard of any Mexican composers ever, who would you suggest they start with?
Carlos Chavez.
Carlos Chavez, and if I'm remembering correctly, he was at least one of the founding members of the Mexico City Philharmonic Orchestra, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, his music was influenced a lot by native Mexican cultures, and he was also a conductor, music theorist, educator. Worked a lot with Abreu as well, the founder of El Sistema in Venezuela. But yeah, he's a great place to start. Definitely Marquez, of course.
Oh yeah, Arturo
But
Marquez. Yeah.
yes, but I would start with Carlos Chavez. He's got a lot of fantastic music, some great quartets as well, string quartets. Yeah.
Well, Alex, gracias por tus palabras. Espero
De nada.
verte pronto.
Sí, igualmente. Muchas gracias, Garrett.
Alex Rosales Garcia in conversation with Garrett McQueen here on Triloquy.
That was something else, wasn't it? Especially that border crossing story.
I can't even imagine.
Ooh, goodness gracious.
And having all of these little the fact that he was getting these, essentially Happy Meal gifts, and he thought that this was, oh, this is really cool. And his mother was probably just torn up on the other
Oh,
side
yeah.
sending it.
Oh, yeah. And then not to mention her story, scaling the fence and running to a Motel 6, all just to have a better life. And I'm not, look, I don't want to make this political or any of that, but people south of the American border who are trying to come here are trying to come here for a reason. They want a better life for themselves. They want to do better for their kids. They want a better future. It's not that they're coming here to do anything else but that.
Fleeing violence,
Right.
And
then some of them are lucky enough, like Alex, to not only thrive here, but participate in what is one of America's most guarded institutions, classical music.
there's a couple of things that stood out to me. First, I got to correct him. Omaha Zoo
Okay.
is at the top.
That's at the top.
Yeah,
All
go
right.
look at their website. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
But the other thing that I really keyed into was he was talking about how he used classical music to teach life lessons.
Yeah.
To get some of these young people thinking about leadership.
Yeah.
And where this could go.
It's incredible. I mean, when I think about what classical music has done for me as, outside of music, I feel like I can lead a group of people a little better because I understand how to lead an ensemble. I know how to play my role as a non-leader in a project or group, as someone who sat in an orchestra, God forbid having to listen to a conductor, but there there are lots of life lessons that you can be taught through music. And when he tells the story of the kids pulling together a traditional banda performance by themselves because they know how to read music, because they know how to play these instruments, because
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z. That's really phenomenal. Shout out to classical music, man.
And evidently, even back in the day, you were shaking the table, creating a competitive environment.
I'm still not great with Sean Mauser, associate principal bassoon of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. It is what it is, but I played the heck out of that solo. There's a recording of it on my website if you're interested.
And that is,
My website, GarrettMcQueen.com.
check it out.
Yeah. Anyway, so next time is going to be a little different. It's going to be, people think that I am a table shaker and I like to take things to race. Well, the next guest on Triloquy is Lee Kuntz. He's the executive director of the Gateways Music Festival. So the Gateways Music Festival is one he describes not as a diversity initiative. This is to celebrate black musicians, period.
Mm.
And he has some opinions on that that you'll enjoy hearing next time.